please forgive me. I'm now of an age when I'm afraid I cannot stand up for an hour, so I will sit down and speak if you don't mind.
Okay.
Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Is it all right?
Yes.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Kerala Higher Education Council for this invitation to speak. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that what I have to say will be of some interest to you, because you will have to listen to me for almost an hour. I would like to speak on three connected concepts that are become central to our lives today, and about which there is perhaps some confusion. They're all concepts that need to be discussed much more fully than we tend to do. And these three concepts are nationalism, secularism, and democracy. These today need wide discussion and more in creating what I would like to call the new identity of the Indian citizen. The identity that should have priority in all our thinking. Let me begin by attempting to explain what I mean by these three concepts. Let's begin with what is nationalism. The simplest answer is that it emerges at a certain point in history, generally connected with specific historical changes. Now, I'm saying this very particularly because people often talk about nationalism in the Mauryan period and nationalism in the Buddha period and nationalism in the Mughal period and so on. No, there was no nationalism then. It is essentially something that belongs to our modern age. Rises in the last 2 centuries, as it were. And the historical changes that accompany this are, first of all, the consciousness of new identities, or the recreating of old identities into new forms. But the newness is what is to be emphasized. A lot of these identities are tied into the basic changes that have been taking place in the last 2 centuries, elements of economic capitalism and industrial technology, as well as ideas of social equality and social justice. This is again something which has existed in the past, but the insistence on these is something much more recent. And the legitimacy of claiming human rights. This is modern. And encapsulating this in the relations between the citizen and the state. Often these historical changes coincided with the emergence of a middle class. The two necessarily don't go together always, but frequently do. And these did not exist in the earlier times because the historical context required for nationalism, democracy, and secularism to emerge was absent. Nationalism brings together the people of contiguous territories into a single territory, claiming that they are connected. They claim common origins, a shared history, religion, and language. And where there are societies similar to ours, in which there are multiple cultural communities, unity lies not only in their coexistence, but as equal entities. This is an important point that needs to be stressed. Above all, there is a political aspiration to a better joint future. History becomes central to these claims. Origins need not be common and may be diverse, as long as they are integrated into the mainstream. And a situation where one community is given primacy over the others and the others are excluded is really not a situation that conforms to nationalism. The mainstream expands with historical change. Therefore, a historical understanding of the past plays a crucial role. Eric Hobsbawm, whom some of you might have heard of, the historian of modern Europe, made a very precise statement when he said that history is to nationalism what the poppy is to the opium addict. It is the source of aspirations, dreams, and the future. And it is a source that justifies the coming together of a nation. But there is a competition among the sections of society for controlling the discourse on nationalism. And this leads to variations. In India, we had one anti-colonial nationalism competing with more than one religious nationalisms. Some people don't call them nationalisms because they are giving priority only to one part of society. But for the sake of our argument and differentiation, let's call it that. Historical origins are intensely debated because some of them are used to justify claims to identity and power. Such claims are the source of the power for that particular community who's making them. History is manipulated and even falsified, if need be, by those endorsing a nationalism linked to a particular community, whether based on religion, caste, or language. Those historians, therefore, who insist on basing history on reliable evidence and logical thinking, which tends to make them a little more secular in their readings, have to be much more alert about how the past is being used in the claims of identifying nationalism with particular communities. States that were earlier independent get realigned into a new potential nation state through nationalism. It is a major historical change. The kingdoms of previous times can be realigned to form the new nation, as happened both in Europe and in India. Many ceased to be monarchies and became democratic republics, as in France. Some continued as monarchies, but with heavily curtailed power in favor of democracy, as in Britain. Earlier boundaries of kingdoms change, as when the Mughal Empire was replaced by the British Indian Empire. And further alterations of the boundaries occurred, of course, after independence. Societies that mutate into nations go through a process whereby the multiple earlier communities and identities of pre-modern times are gradually given less prominence. A new national identity emerges. It is often asked whether the theory of nationalism is something tangible or is it an intangible idea that is powerful as an idea in bringing communities together in a new way. An author by the name of Benedict Anderson, whom you might have heard of again, argues that it creates an imagined community. However, even as such, as an imagined community, the idea leads to new social and political forms. The nation state that emerges is very different from the kingdoms of the past. That it is new is symbolized in the self-perception of the people. They no longer see themselves as the subjects of a king, the praja of the Raja. They see themselves as citizens of a state, and this is a very different category. This change from subjects to citizens is a crucial aspect of nationalism that we need to underline much more. The community identity that people had in previous times, such as identities of religion, language, ethnicity, and so on, these have to give way to a new identity, that of the nation and its relationship to the citizen. This mutation from subject to citizen is a qualitative change. It is not, if it is not properly defined, either by accident or deliberately, then the earlier identities linked to communities remain the primary identity. They don't give way to the new identity. In a nation, diverse identities are certainly accommodated, but they are no longer primary. They continue, but as subordinated to the new primary and overarching identity of being citizens of a nation. The growth of anti-colonial nationalism in colonial societies brought in a significant change when the colonized people became familiar with the idea that they, the colonized, even as underprivileged people, could demand representation. And together with this came democratic rights and social justice. Liberal and democratic forms were essential to the nation state. This encouraged freedom of expression in every field, and even the orthodoxy was questioned. Removing social inequalities led to theories of social justice, and challenging the idea that the world and all its creatures, including human beings, were created by God, led to theories of evolution. And the 19th century, as you know, is full of these theories, and they continue. Such thinking encouraged the explorations of scientific knowledge, and these debates in Europe also made an impact on the educated in the colonies. And such ideas, combined with the iniquities of colonial control, strengthened anti-colonial nationalism in the colony. This posed a dilemma for the colonial power. The claim was that European civilization made Europe superior to the colonized world. But this knowledge, in the minds of the educated people amongst the colonized, enabled them to question colonial control. So there's a paradox here where the colonials are teaching you something and you use that teaching to question their power. The idea of a nation and what it implied in terms of social and political change also spread among the colonized and gave power to anti-colonial movements. Freedom from colonial control inevitably raised questions regarding other kinds of control in India, namely the control of religious laws and caste observances. And the history of the 19th century is full of these kinds of questionings and solutions. In a sense, anti-colonial nationalism gave shape to a wider nationalism in India. Nationalism implied that the older identities of religious, caste and language communities would gradually have to give way to a secular identity, that of the nation and the citizen. The idea of an Indian nation and the Indian citizen started to become real. Both were historically new experiences. And I'm emphasizing this very strongly, that what we have been going through in the last 100 years or even a little earlier, these are new experiences and we have to really learn to understand them and grapple with them and debate them and so on. What was the idea of India on which so much has been written in the last 50 years? It has been seen essentially as the evolving and defining of the Indian nation. In terms of territory, it was a country ruled by the British with changes after partition. It consisted of a multiple body of people differing in language, caste, religion, culture. They had a shared history with new people entering at many points of time and space and contributing to the culture and to the pattern of life. Attempts are made to recognize that there were differences as well as agreements in this shared history. and this is common right through the world. This is not typical of India. This is another reason why the exploring of the past is so significant, to see the differences and to see the commonalities. Anti-colonial nationalism gave a shape to at least the idea that the Indian citizen should be the primary category of the Indian nation. This meant that the older identities of language, religion, caste and whatever that had once been the primary identities were not to be discarded, but were to be subordinated to the new and primary identity of the citizen. This allowed religious and other identities to be part of the substratum, but the identity of the citizen had primacy and had to be a secular identity. It had to be secular in order to distance itself from the narrower communal identities. This nationalist perspective was contradicted by the colonial insistence that India has consisted always, early times, not of one nation but of two, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, each based on identity with the specific religion. The colonial projection was intended to oppose the idea of Indian nationalism. Nevertheless, it was successfully planted in some Indian minds through colonial policy, and it took root. Yet in theory, it was rejected by many among anti-colonial nationalists, since religious identities were contrary to secularism, and secularism was seen as a foundation of the nation. The success of anti-colonial nationalism lay in the removal of the colonial power and in the coming of Indian independence. We might remind ourselves as to what was the idea of India at the time of independence. It was being shaped by this new relationship that was being projected between the Indian citizen and the emerging Indian nation. The relationship was based on the duties, obligations and rights of each, the state and the citizen, with what rights and duties they had towards each other. Such a relationship had not existed before, since much of governance was based on precedence and convention. These duties and rights had to be set out in a constitution, and this ensured their security as long as the constitution was protected. So when these debates come up about what can be removed from the constitution these days, be sure to ask yourselves the question, what is the issue behind the removal? What is not being secured? What is not being protected of the rights that we have as citizens? One of the first acts of the independent government was to establish a constitution. The constitution that created the Republic of India and its democratic structure was a basic feature of the Indian nation. Therefore, attempts to change the constitution are a very serious matter. Suggested changes and their implications have to be discussed down to the smallest detail. Citizens rely on Parliament and on the judiciary to protect the Constitution. It is equally incumbent on the judiciary and the government to ensure that the rights granted by the Constitution are in fact protected. Sometimes this is done, but sometimes the action is contrary to the Constitution and has therefore to be publicly questioned. The state performs its duties through its governance and administration, and by which it should protect the rights of the citizen. These, at a minimum, are the right to life, livelihood, health, education, social justice, and above all, the equality of status. If these rights are ensured, then the citizen would be expected to perform his or her duties to assist in the perpetuation of these rights. If they are not ensured and not effective, then there will be a legitimate demand that they be made so. The rights of citizens have to be protected, the implementation of these rights for all citizens, irrespective of their previous identities of religion or caste, are crucial to the functioning of the nation. They should not exist only in theory or only for the economic and political elite, but for all citizens. This is not so as yet. The central identity above all others has to be that of the citizen with full rights and is therefore of necessity a secular identity. That this should be guaranteed requires a substantial change in social and political attitudes from earlier times, both among those being governed and those governing. In earlier times, the differences of caste and religious sects that defines communities encouraged diverse identities of unequal status. Many of these will continue for a while, although identities also mutate with historical change. A national identity does not require anyone to give up a religious or caste identity, but the obvious difference from earlier times is that the primary identity has to be that of secular citizen. The new identity of the citizen has to be created, nurtured, and given primacy. This basic fact is unfortunately either not understood these days or else has been deliberately ignored by those in authority. In countries that are ex-colonies, nationalism has two phases. One is the anti-colonial movement that helps establish the independence of the country. The second phase, equally important, is the establishing of democracy and secularism. The two are interconnected in creating the identity of the citizen. This is what anti-colonial nationalism was trying to implement in the early years after independence. Once the colonial power was removed, the intention was to continue with this second phase of nationalism. But this had been diverted, particularly through the ambition of some among the majority community who were anxious to control power. The dominance of the upper caste was being reasserted in various ways, as in the form of the new economic elite and in claims to dominant status. Identity politics focused on the aspirations of religio-political groups. Attempts continued to be made to revive and encourage the strengthening of community identities based on religion and in accordance with colonial explanations of Indian society. Secular nationalism, emphasizing the equal status of all citizens, was not adequately implemented. These were the values that we had cherished before independence and just after, since they were to be the making of a new society of citizens of equal status. But that has not happened. We have to ask ourselves then why this has not happened. We have lost sight of the fundamental change inherent in creating a modern nation, namely the rights of the citizen in reality, in relation to the nation. But in this process, we seem to have deserted even the values of our earlier identities. We no longer uphold and defend even the positive values of tolerance that religions once propagated. At least they propagated them even if they didn't follow them. But we have ceased to propagate that. For example,